Welcome to Story Planet. Step into a world where time flows differently. As you embark on this journey, you're invited to experience moments from the past that shape the present. Whether it's reliving cherished memories or discovering forgotten treasures, you're in for an unforgettable ride. Enjoy every second of your journey through the timeless moments of Ticket to Yesterday. The fire crackled softly in the cozy countryside cottage, its warmth wrapping around Brenda as she sat in her favorite rocking chair by the window. The scent of old books, lavender, and freshly brewed tea filled the air. Outside, the hills stretched endlessly, a quiet reminder of all they had been. The railway tracks in the distance, now silent, had once been the threads that wove together her life's journey. She had spent 40 years aboard trains, watching landscapes blur past, meeting people from every walk of life. Each station, each passenger, each journey had left an imprint on her soul. Brenda rocked gently, her mind floating through the past, through the echoes of laughter, whispered confessions, teary farewells, and hopeful beginnings. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup, lost in thought until a soft voice pulled her back to the present. "Grandma?" Oliver peeked into the room, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Brenda turned to him with a smile. "Oh, just the past, my love. The places I've been, the people I've met. The train was my world for so many years. It still is, in a way." Oliver walked closer and climbed to the armrest of her chair. "Tell me about it. About your life on the train." Brenda chuckled, setting her cup down. "Well, where should I begin? I wasn't always a train conductor, you know. I was just a small girl in a town much like this one, growing up with the sound of train whistles in my ears. My father was an engineer. My mother worked at the station. The railway ran through my life like a river, always there, always calling." She sighed softly, her fingers grazing the wooden armrest. "I remember sitting at the station for hours, watching the passengers rush by. Some looked excited, some worried, and some carried a sadness in their eyes that I didn't understand back then. But every one of them had a destination, a purpose, a story." Oliver rested his chin on his hands, his eyes sparkling with curiosity. "Did you always want to work on trains?" Brenda shook her head. "Oh no, I thought about being a teacher, a baker, even a writer. But no matter what I imagined for my future, the railway was always in my heart. When I was 22, I finally answered the call and became a conductor. And that was when the real adventure began." She leaned back, gazing out toward the quiet, empty tracks beyond the hills. "For 40 years, I traveled across countries, meeting people who carried their own stories, their own dreams, their own burdens. Some were lost, some were found. Some were running away, and some were searching for something they hadn't even named yet." She paused, sipping her tea, savoring the warmth. "I've met young dreamers, weary travelers, old souls with stories too heavy to carry alone. There was magic in those encounters. You never knew who would sit beside you, what their story would be, or how their path would intertwine with yours." Oliver's voice softened in wonder. "Did you ever get lonely, Grandma?" Brenda looked at him with warmth in her eyes. "Not for a second, my love. Trains don't just take you places, they bring people to you, and some of those people stay in your heart forever." She glanced toward an old wooden chest by the fireplace, filled with keepsakes from her travels. Tucked inside were letters, postcards, and small tokens, reminders of the people she had met and the stories she carried. She reached for a folded note and handed it to Oliver. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words written in elegant script. "Thank you for listening. You gave me hope when I had none left." He looked up. "Who wrote this?" Brenda smiled wistfully. "A soldier I once met on a long train ride through the mountains. But his story, my dear, is for another night." She stood and walked toward a wooden shelf, picking up an old leather-bound notebook. Flipping through its pages, her fingers brushed against handwritten notes and sketches. This book holds the stories of the people I met, the ones who left a mark on my heart. Some of them shared their secrets with me. Some of them didn't say a word, yet I still understood them. Oliver curled up in her lap, letting out a small yawn. I want to hear about them, all the people you met. Brenda smiled, stroking his hair gently. Then that's what we'll do. Every night, I'll tell you about one of them. 8 stories for 8 incredible people who crossed my path and left a piece of themselves with me. Oliver grinned sleepily. Like bedtime stories? Exactly like bedtime stories, Brenda whispered. Some will make you laugh, some might make you cry, but all of them will remind you how incredible people can be. Oliver burrowed into the blanket, his eyes already drooping with the weight of sleep. Who's first? Brenda kissed his forehead. Tomorrow, we begin with Lucas, the runaway pianist who played music like he was telling secrets to the wind. Oliver let out a content sigh, already dreaming of the stories yet to come. Brenda rocked gently, gazing at the quiet tracks outside. The past was always with her, a train of memories rolling endlessly through time. Tomorrow, the journey would begin again. The soft glow of the bedside lamp cast warm, golden light across Oliver's bedroom as Brenda tucked him in. Outside, the rain had settled into a gentle drizzle, creating a rhythmic patter against the window. The room was cozy, filled with the scent of chamomile tea and the faint aroma of old wood from the bookshelves. Oliver stretched under his blankets, eyes still sparkling with excitement from the previous night. "Grandma," he murmured sleepily. "Tonight's the night, right? The first story?" Brenda smiled, settling into her chair beside his bed, her hands gently cradling her teacup. "Yes, my love. Tonight I'll tell you about a boy named Lucas. He was a pianist, a dreamer, and a runaway." Oliver's brows furrowed in curiosity. "A runaway?" Brenda nodded. "Yes, but not from danger. He was running toward something, his dream." She took a slow sip of her tea before beginning, her voice soft and warm. "It was late one autumn evening when I first saw Lucas. The train was leaving Vienna, the sky painted with deep shades of purple and gold. He sat alone by the window, fingers dancing across an invisible keyboard, playing a silent melody. His suitcase was small, worn, as if it had seen many journeys before this one. His eyes held something between longing and determination, as though he was chasing something only he could see. Brenda closed her eyes briefly, remembering that night. I walked down the aisle, checking tickets as always, but something about Lucas made me pause. There was a story there, just waiting to be told. When I reached him, he barely noticed me at first. His mind was lost in his music. She leaned forward slightly, her hands wrapped around the warmth of her tea. I asked for his ticket, and he fumbled in his pocket before handing it to me. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice soft, almost hesitant. Oliver listened intently, his fingers gripping the edge of his blanket. Was he scared? Brenda shook her head. Not scared, just lost in thought. I smiled and handed his ticket back. "Are you a pianist?" I asked him. That was when he really looked at me, his dark eyes widening in surprise. "How did you know?" he asked. She chuckled. It wasn't hard to tell. His fingers never stopped moving, even when there was no piano in front of him. That's how true musicians are. They play even when there's no instrument to be heard. Oliver's lips curled into a small smile. "So what happened next?" Brenda sighed wistfully. "We started talking. Lucas told me that he had been playing the piano since he was a little boy, but his parents didn't believe music was a real future. They wanted him to study business, something practical, something stable. But Lucas had music inside him. It wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. So he left home, hoping to find a place where his music could truly belong." Oliver's brows knit together. "That must have been really hard." Brenda nodded. "Yes, it was. But sometimes, my dear, the hardest journeys lead us to the places we were always meant to be." She glanced at the bookshelf where a small, folded piece of paper rested. a music sheet that Lucas had once given her. Lucas had no idea where he was going, but he wasn't afraid. He believed that if he followed the music, it would lead him home. She smiled, remembering how the quiet train car had filled with the softest notes when Lucas finally pulled out a small travel-sized keyboard from his bag. He played that night, just for himself, but everyone who heard it felt something stir in their hearts. Oliver yawned, his eyes heavy with sleep. "Did he ever find his place, Grandma?" Brenda's smile softened. "I like to believe that he did. That somewhere, he's sitting at a grand piano, playing for people who truly understand him." She took a deep breath, lost in thought. "That night, after he played, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, 'Music is a home of its own. No matter where I go, as long as I play, I'm never lost.'" Oliver blinked sleepily. "That's beautiful." Brenda tucked the blanket around him a little tighter. "It is, my love, because dreams have a way of leading us where we're meant to be." She rocked slightly in her chair, her fingers brushing against her teacup. The train pulled into the next station, and Lucas stood up, preparing to leave. He smiled at me and handed me a folded piece of sheet music. "For you," he said, "a piece I wrote about the journey we're all on." Oliver's eyes fluttered closed. "I wish I could hear it." Brenda chuckled softly. "Perhaps one day someone will play it again." Oliver let out a soft sigh, curling deeper into his blankets. "I hope so." Brenda leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Sleep well, my dear. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the silent soldier who carried more than just memories of war." Oliver's breathing slowed, lost in dreams of pianos and moonlit train rides. Brenda sat back in her chair, staring out at the darkened window, the echoes of Lucas's music still alive in her mind. The journey continued. The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. The rain from the previous evening had left the air crisp and cool, and the scent of damp earth drifted in through the slightly open window. Brenda sat beside Oliver's bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminating her kind features. She cradled her teacup in her hands, the warmth seeping into her palms as she prepared to tell her next story. Oliver shifted under his blanket, his eyes heavy but eager. "You said tonight is about the soldier," he murmured sleepily. "What was he like?" Brenda took a deep breath, staring past the room as if looking through time itself. "He was a man of few words, my love, but sometimes silence carries the heaviest stories." She set her tea down and folded her hands in her lap. It was winter, and the train was making its way through the snow-covered countryside. Everything outside was blanketed in white, the trees bending under the weight of the frost. The train was warm inside, filled with the scent of strong coffee and the quiet murmurs of passengers. That's when I saw him, seated alone near the back, staring out the window. He had an old duffel bag at his feet, a thick coat wrapped around his broad shoulders, and eyes that had seen too much. Oliver frowned slightly. "Was he sad?" Brenda nodded. "More than sad. There was a quiet pain about him, like someone who carried memories too heavy to speak of." I walked past him several times that evening, checking tickets, greeting passengers. He never looked up, never spoke a word. She traced the rim of her teacup, remembering the details. At one point, I stopped beside him, just watching. His hands were rough, his knuckles scarred, but they trembled slightly, as if carrying an invisible weight. After a moment, I said, "Is this your first time on this route?" Oliver's eyes widened. Did he answer? Brenda smiled faintly. Not at first. He simply glanced at me, then turned back to the window. But after a long pause, he nodded. It was a small gesture, but it was something. She leaned back, settling deeper into her chair. I didn't press him with questions. Some people need time before they let their stories unfold, so I simply sat down across from him, resting my hands in my lap, waiting. Oliver watched her closely. Did he ever speak? Brenda exhaled softly. Eventually, yes. The train ride stretched into the evening, the world outside turning dark. and just when I thought he might never say a word, he spoke. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, hearing his voice again in her mind. "I used to take this route before," he said quietly. His voice was deep, weary, like a man who had spent too long walking through storms, a long time ago. Brenda's fingers curled around her teacup. "He told me he had been a soldier. He had spent years serving in places far away, places where the sun burned hot and the nights were long. He had seen things he wished he could forget, but memories don't work that way. War had taken pieces of him, pieces he could never get back." Oliver's voice was barely a whisper. "Was he coming home?" Brenda nodded. "Yes, but home wasn't the same anymore. He had left behind a wife, a daughter too young to understand why he had to leave. Years had passed, and he didn't know if they would welcome him back. He didn't know if he was even the same man who had left." A deep silence filled the room, the weight of the story settling between them. Oliver swallowed hard. "Did they?" Brenda's lips curled into the softest smile. "We reached his station just before midnight. He stood up, adjusting his coat, gripping the strap of his bag like it was the only thing holding him together. As he stepped off the train, he hesitated. And then I saw them. A woman, standing under the dim glow of the station lights, and beside her a young girl, bundled up in a wool coat, holding a small sign that simply said, 'Daddy.'" Oliver's breath hitched. "Oh," Brenda nodded, her own eyes glistening at the memory. He froze for a moment, almost as if he couldn't believe they were real. But then his daughter ran to him, her arms wide open, and just like that, the weight he carried seemed to lift. He dropped his bag, fell to his knees, and held her like he'd never let go again. Oliver sniffed, rubbing his nose against his blanket. "That's a good ending." Brenda leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Some stories don't need words, my love. Some are told in the way arms hold tight, in the way tears fall without shame, and some are told in the silence of two people standing together again after too long apart." Oliver curled deeper into his bed, his eyes drifting shut. "I like this one," he murmured. "It feels warm." Brenda smiled, running a gentle hand through his hair. "Tomorrow I'll tell you about the woman in the wedding dress, the runaway bride." Oliver's breathing slowed, lost in dreams of soldiers coming home and daughters waiting with signs in the night. Brenda sat back, staring at the soft glow of the bedside lamp. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, but inside, everything was still. Another journey completed. Another story remembered. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silver beams through the sheer curtains of Oliver's bedroom window. The night air carried a crispness that hinted at the changing seasons, and the faint hoot of an owl echoed from the trees beyond the garden. Brenda sat in her familiar spot beside Oliver's bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, steam curling into the dimly lit room. The clock on the nightstand ticked softly, marking the passing moments as Oliver stretched under his blanket. "Grandma," Oliver murmured sleepily, his voice thick with curiosity. "You said tonight is about the woman in the wedding dress." Brenda smiled warmly, settling deeper into her chair. "Yes, my love. Tonight I'll tell you about a bride who wasn't running toward something. She was running away." Oliver's eyes widened. "She left her wedding?" Brenda nodded. "Indeed she did, and I met her on a train bound for nowhere." She took a slow sip of her tea, letting the memory unfold in her mind. It was a bright spring afternoon. The train had just pulled out of Paris, the sun shining down on the rolling countryside. Passengers bustled about, arranging their luggage, finding their seats, greeting their travel companions. And then there was her, a woman, no older than 30, sitting alone in the corner of the carriage, dressed in a flowing white wedding gown. Oliver gasped, pulling his blanket up to his chin. "A real wedding dress?" Brenda chuckled. "A real one, lace and all." The contrast was striking. There she sat, a vision of elegance, yet her face was pale, her eyes distant. She clutched a bouquet in her lap, the petals wilting slightly in the warmth of the train. Oliver tilted his head. Was she sad? Brenda sighed. Sad, perhaps, but more than that, she looked lost, like she was searching for something she hadn't yet named. I walked past her once, then twice, wondering whether to ask if she needed anything. Finally, I couldn't resist. I sat down across from her and offered her a warm smile. You don't see a bride on a train every day, I said. Oliver giggled. What did she say? Brenda's expression softened. At first, nothing. She just looked at me, as if debating whether she should tell her story. And then, after a long pause, she whispered, I couldn't do it. Oliver blinked. She couldn't get married? Brenda nodded. Exactly. She told me that she had spent months planning her wedding, a grand affair with hundreds of guests, a ballroom full of flowers, a dress that took weeks to be sewn just right. But the closer the day came, the heavier it felt. It should have been the happiest day of my life, she said, but instead it felt like a door closing on me forever. Oliver frowned. Did she love him? Brenda let out a slow breath. That's the question she asked herself over and over. She said he was kind, intelligent, a good man, but something was missing. She felt like she was playing a role in someone else's story, rather than living her own. Oliver furrowed his brows. So she ran away? Brenda smiled gently. Yes, my dear. Just hours before she was meant to walk down the aisle, she slipped away, caught a cab to the station, and bought the first ticket she could find. Oliver's eyes gleamed. But where was she going? Brenda shook her head. She didn't know, and that was the beauty of it. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't following a path that had been decided for her. She was choosing her own. Oliver yawned, nestling deeper into his pillow. Was she scared? Brenda tilted her head in thought. Maybe a little, but when she spoke of the future, there was excitement in her voice. For the first time in my life, she told me, I'm writing my own story. She took another sip of her tea, her gaze distant. We talked for hours, watching the countryside roll by, and when the train arrived at its final stop, she stood up, smoothed out her dress, and looked at me with the softest smile. Thank you, she said, for listening. And then, just like that, she was gone. Oliver blinked sleepily. Did you ever see her again? Brenda smiled wistfully. No, but I like to believe she found what she was looking for. Oliver let out a small sigh, his voice barely a whisper. I hope she did. Brenda leaned down, kissing his forehead. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the orphan with the sketchbook, the boy who saw the world in colors no one else did. Oliver's breathing slowed, lost in dreams of runaway brides and unwritten stories. Brenda sat back, gazing at the gentle flicker of the bedside lamp. Outside, the night stretched on, endless and full of possibility, just like the stories she carried in her heart. The night was calm, and a gentle breeze carried the distant scent of rain through Oliver's open window. The boy shifted under his blankets, his excitement barely hidden beneath his sleepy eyes. Brenda sat beside him, sipping her tea, the glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The stories had become their ritual, each night another glimpse into the lives of those who had left a mark on her journey. Grandma, Oliver murmured, stretching his arms. Tonight's about the boy with the sketchbook, right? Brenda smiled. Yes, my love. Tonight, I'll tell you about the orphan who saw the world in a way no one else did. She leaned back, her fingers gently tapping against her teacup. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the sky stretches gray as far as the eye can see. The train was nearly empty that day, save for a few scattered travelers lost in their own worlds. And then, in the very last row, I saw him. A boy, no older than 10, sitting with a small leather bag beside him and a thick sketchbook resting on his lap. Oliver's brow furrowed. All alone? Brenda nodded. Yes. His clothes were neat but worn, his shoes slightly too big for his feet. He sat so still, completely absorbed in his drawings, his pencil moving across the page like it had a life of its own. She took another slow sip of her tea. I walked up to him, checked his ticket, and asked if he needed anything. He barely looked up, just shook his head and kept sketching. That's when I saw it. The page was filled with tiny, intricate drawings of everyone in the train car. The older woman knitting, the man reading his newspaper, the mother humming to her baby. But they weren't just simple sketches. They had expressions, emotions, stories hidden in their faces. He saw things most people never noticed. Oliver's mouth parted slightly. Was he really that good? Brenda chuckled. He was more than good. He was gifted. I watched for a while, mesmerized by how he brought life to the paper. After some time, I finally asked, "What do you see when you draw?" She set her cup down and clasped her hands together, her voice soft with memory. The boy looked up at me then, really looked. His eyes were deep, thoughtful, older than his years. And he said, "I see what people try to hide." Oliver blinked in surprise. What did he mean? Brenda sighed, running a gentle hand along the edge of her chair. I asked him the same thing. He explained that when he looked at people, he didn't just see their faces. He saw the way their hands trembled when they held a cup, the way their shoulders slumped from a heavy heart, the way their smiles didn't always reach their eyes. People don't say everything out loud, he told me, but they show it if you know where to look. Oliver shifted under his blanket, fascinated. How did he learn that? Brenda hesitated, her heart aching at the memory. He had spent most of his life in orphanages. He had learned early on how to read people, who was kind, who was cruel, who had love left to give, and who had lost it along the way. She closed her eyes for a moment. He told me he was being sent to live with an aunt he had never met before. I don't know if she'll like me, he admitted, but if I draw her, maybe I'll know before she even speaks. Oliver's voice was barely above a whisper. Was he scared? Brenda nodded. I think so, but he hid it well. He had learned to watch the world, to understand it, to capture it in his drawings. He just hadn't yet learned how to trust it. She picked up her tea again, gazing at the swirling steam. When the train finally reached his stop, he stood up, clutching his sketchbook like a shield. He hesitated for a moment, then suddenly tore out a page. He held it out to me with a small, "This is you," he said. Oliver sat up straighter. What was it? Brenda's voice softened. It was a drawing of me, but not just how I looked. It was how he saw me. He had drawn me with warm eyes, a quiet strength in my posture, and a gentle kindness that I didn't even realize I carried. He saw past my uniform, past the job, past the routine. He saw me. Oliver's lips curled into a small, sleepy smile. That's really special. Brenda nodded. It was. I still have it, tucked away in my old wooden chest. She sighed wistfully. The boy stepped off the train, his tiny figure disappearing into the evening light. I watched him go, hoping his aunt would see him the way he saw others, hoping she would give him a place where he didn't have to read between the lines to know he was loved. Oliver yawned, stretching his arms above his head. I hope she did. Brenda reached out, brushing a hand gently through his hair. Me too, my love. Me too. She leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about the secret millionaire, the man who taught me that wealth isn't always what it seems. Oliver's eyes fluttered closed, his breathing evening out as sleep pulled him under. Brenda sat back, her gaze lingering on the dimly lit room, the echoes of a boy's pencil strokes still fresh in her heart. Outside, the night stretched on, filled with the unseen stories of the world, waiting for someone to notice them. The soft ticking of the clock filled the quiet room as Oliver snuggled into his blanket, the warmth of another bedtime story settling around him like a cozy embrace. Brenda rocked gently in her chair, sipping her tea, her gaze momentarily lost in the flickering candlelight. She had told so many stories already, each one carrying a piece of her heart, yet this one, this particular encounter, always made her smile. "Grandma," Oliver murmured sleepily. Who was the man who didn't seem rich, but really was? Brenda chuckled softly. Ah, yes, the secret millionaire. He wasn't like most people with wealth. You wouldn't have known it by looking at him. No fine suits, no expensive watches, no airs of importance. He dressed like an ordinary man, blending into the world like he belonged to every place and no place at all. She set her tea down, adjusting the shawl draped over her shoulders. It was an autumn evening, and the train was rolling through the countryside, golden leaves swirling in the wind outside. The cabin was quiet, most passengers lost in their own thoughts. And there he was, sitting by the window, a man in a weathered coat, his boots scuffed, his hands rough and worn. His suitcase, if you could call it that, was an old canvas bag, the kind travelers had seen better days with. Oliver frowned slightly. He didn't look rich at all? Brenda shook her head. Not even a little. When I first saw him, I assumed he was just another weary traveler. But there was something different about him. While others rushed to their seats, buried in their books or gazing at their watches, he sat with a quiet ease, as if time was a thing that belonged to him rather than the other way around. Oliver nestled deeper into his blanket. Did you talk to him? Brenda smiled. Not at first. He sat there, watching the world pass by, a knowing twinkle in his eyes. When I approached to check his ticket, he gave me the warmest smile, the kind that made you feel like an old friend even if you'd never met before. It's a beautiful evening, isn't it? He said, handing me his ticket. Oliver blinked. That's all he said? Brenda chuckled. At first, yes, but I could tell he had seen a great deal in his life. So I sat across from him, curiosity getting the better of me. You travel often? I asked. He let out a soft chuckle. More than most, less than some, he replied. The journey is always more interesting than the destination. Oliver tilted his head. What did he mean? Brenda sighed, her eyes twinkling with remembrance. He meant that life isn't just about where we end up. It's about the people we meet, the moments we collect, the small kindnesses that make a day meaningful. She picked up her tea again, taking a slow sip before continuing. I watched him for a while, intrigued by his simplicity. He had no expensive luggage, no flashy gadgets, just a small notebook filled with scribbled notes. I asked him what he wrote, and he smiled. Thoughts, he said. Observations, pieces of stories I pick up along the way. Oliver grinned. Like you, Grandma, Brenda laughed. Something like that. The more we talked, the more I realized he wasn't an ordinary traveler. He spoke of places all over the world, not just the landmarks, but the people, the hidden cafes, the small bakeries where the bread was baked just right. He spoke like someone who had lived 1,000 different lives. Oliver's voice softened. Did you ever find out who he really was? Brenda leaned back, a fond smile on her lips. Not right away. But then at one of the stops, an older woman boarded the train, struggling with her heavy bags. Without hesitation, he got up and helped her, treating her with the kindness of an old friend. When she thanked him, she suddenly paused, studying him carefully. And then, with a gasp, she said his name. Oliver sat up slightly. Who was he? Brenda exhaled softly. His name was Thomas Everett. A man whose name meant little to most people on that train, but to the woman and later to me, it meant something incredible. He was a philanthropist, a quiet millionaire who had spent years giving away most of his fortune to help others. Schools, orphanages, shelters, his donations had changed lives. But he never took credit. He never wanted recognition. Oliver's eyes widened. He gave away all his money? Brenda nodded. Nearly all of it. He believed that wealth wasn't meant to be hoarded but shared. What good is having more than you need, he told me, if you can't use it to make someone else's journey a little easier? Oliver blinked, absorbing the words. Wow. Brenda reached out, smoothing his hair. Not all rich people wear diamonds, my love. Some carry their wealth in the kindness they give, in the hope they spread. Oliver yawned, his voice soft. Did you ever see him again? Brenda shook her head. No. But as he left the train that evening, he handed me a small slip of paper. On it, he had written a quote. "At the end of the journey, we take nothing with us but the love we've given away." She watched as Oliver's eyelids grew heavier, his breathing slowing. "Tomorrow I'll tell you about the scientist who was searching for memories he had lost." Oliver murmured sleepily, "I like this one, Grandma. It feels important." Brenda leaned down, kissing his forehead. "It is, my love, because the richest hearts aren't the ones full of gold. They're the ones full of kindness." She sat back, gazing at the dimly lit room, the echoes of a quiet millionaire's wisdom lingering in the night air. Outside, the train of memories kept moving, carrying her stories into another night. A cool breeze whispered through the slightly open window, carrying the distant hum of crickets and the faint rustling of trees. Oliver lay beneath his blanket, eyes barely open yet filled with anticipation. He had been thinking about the last story all day, the one about the secret millionaire. But tonight, there was something new to uncover. Brenda sat beside him, her teacup cradled in her hands, the soft glow of the lamp casting a golden halo around her. "Grandma," Oliver murmured, shifting slightly. "Tonight's the one about the scientist, right?" Brenda smiled, her hand over his forehead. "Yes, my love. Tonight, I'll tell you about a man who spent his whole life searching, not for treasure, not for success, but for something far more precious. He was searching for memories." Oliver blinked up at her, intrigued. "Did he lose them?" Brenda nodded. "He did. And in losing them, he found something unexpected." She took a deep breath, letting the memory unfold in her mind. It was a foggy morning, and the train was traveling through a valley, mist rolling over the hills like waves. The air inside was warm, passengers wrapped in thick scarves, their breath fogging up the windows. That's when I saw him, a man, perhaps in his 70s, dressed in an old wool coat, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He held a leather-bound journal in his lap, but instead of writing in it, he simply turned the pages, over and over again, as if searching for something hidden within the ink. Mysteries of memory, but now he was facing his greatest challenge. His own was fading. Oliver's face fell. "Was he sick?" Brenda nodded, her voice softer now. "Yes. He had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia. He knew what was coming, knew that eventually pieces of himself would begin to disappear. So he started writing everything down, his thoughts, his discoveries, his past, anything that mattered. And yet, no matter how many pages he filled, he still felt like something was slipping through his fingers." Oliver bit his lip. "That's really sad." Brenda reached out, squeezing his hand gently. It was, but there was also something beautiful in the way he fought to hold on to what he loved. When I sat down beside him, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with quiet frustration. "I can't remember what I was looking for," he confessed. "I know it was important, but the more I try to grasp it, the further it drifts away." She leaned back in her chair, gazing at the ceiling as if seeing the past play out before her. I told him that sometimes memories aren't meant to be chased. Sometimes they come back when we least expect them. He smiled at that, but there was sadness in it too. Oliver frowned. Did he ever remember what he was looking for? Brenda let out a deep breath. Not at first. But then, as the train rolled on, something happened. A little girl sitting across the aisle began humming a tune, soft, almost like a whisper. The moment he heard it, he froze. His hands trembled, his eyes filled with something I can only describe as wonder. And then, the tears came. Oliver sat up slightly. Why? What was the song? Brenda's voice was barely above a whisper. It was a lullaby, one his mother used to sing to him when he was a child. He hadn't heard it in decades, hadn't even known he had forgotten it, and yet in that moment the memory rushed back to him as if it had never left. She smiled softly. That's the thing about memories, Oliver. They don't always stay where we leave them. Sometimes they hide in music, in scents, in the feel of an old book, or the sight of a familiar place. And sometimes, when we need them most, they come home. Oliver's eyes shone with quiet awe. Did he say anything? Brenda nodded. He looked at me, wiping his eyes, and said, I thought I was losing myself, but maybe, just maybe, the important things find their way back to us. She let those words settle, watching as Oliver's small fingers played with the edge of his blanket. After a moment, he let out a contented sigh. That was a good one, Grandma. Brenda leaned down, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Tomorrow, I'll tell you about a mother who never stopped searching for her son. Oliver nestled deeper into his pillow, his breathing slowing. Brenda watched over him, listening to the quiet night beyond the window. Somewhere, in the great tapestry of time, memories drifted like autumn leaves, waiting for the perfect moment to return home. A cool wind rustled the curtains as Oliver nestled beneath his blankets, blinking up at his grandmother with drowsy eyes. The weight of the last story still lingered in his thoughts, but now another awaited. Brenda sat beside him, teacup in hand, her fingers curling around its warmth as she prepared to take him on another journey, one of longing, of love, and of an unbreakable bond. Tonight, she said softly, brushing a strand of his hair from his forehead, I'll tell you about a mother who never gave up, a woman whose heart carried the weight of hope for 15 years. Oliver stirred slightly. 15 years? He echoed, his voice tinged with quiet disbelief. Brenda nodded, her eyes growing distant as the memory surfaced. It was a quiet afternoon on the train, the sky outside pale and overcast, as though the world itself was holding its breath. I had just finished my rounds when I noticed her, a woman sitting by the window, a small, tattered photograph clasped tightly in her hands. Oliver frowned slightly. Who was in the picture? Brenda sighed. A young boy, no older than 5 or 6. His face was frozen in time, captured in a moment of childhood innocence. And yet the way she held that photo, the way her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the edges, it told me everything I needed to know. She was searching for him. Oliver's breath caught. Her son? Brenda nodded. Yes, she had lost him 15 years ago, and she had spent every day since trying to find him. Oliver's face twisted with emotion. How does someone lose their own child? Brenda's voice was gentle. Sometimes life is cruel. She told me that one moment he was holding her hand at a train station, and the next he was gone, taken, vanished into the crowd. Oliver shuddered. That's horrible. Brenda took a slow sip of her tea. It is, but what struck me most was not the sorrow in her eyes. It was the fire, the determination. She had searched every city, followed every lead, knocked on countless doors. He's out there, she told me. I know it in my heart. A mother always knows. Oliver clutched his blanket, eyes shining with hope. Did she ever find him? Brenda hesitated, a bittersweet smile touching her lips. Not that day, but something remarkable happened. Another passenger overheard our conversation, a man who had once worked at an orphanage in a town far away. He leaned forward and said, There was a boy who was found alone at a station years ago. He never spoke of where he came from. Oliver held his breath. Was it him? Brenda's voice softened. We didn't know for sure, but for the first time in years she had a new path to follow, a new hope. She grasped the stranger's hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. Tell me everything, she pleaded, and he did. Oliver exhaled slowly. So, what happened next? Brenda smiled faintly. I never saw her again after that, but I like to believe she found him, that her search led her back to the child she had never stopped loving. Oliver swallowed hard, curling deeper into his bed. 15 years is a long time to hope. Brenda leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. It is, but love is patient, and a mother's love? That never fades. Oliver's eyelids grew heavy, his breathing slowing as sleep tugged at him. Brenda sat beside him a moment longer, watching him drift off, then turned her gaze toward the window. Somewhere beyond the quiet night, there were still stories being written, still reunions waiting to happen. Tomorrow, another tale awaited. But for now, the night was peaceful, filled only with the whispers of dreams. The night was still, save for the gentle rustling of tree branches outside Oliver's window. A soft glow from the bedside lamp bathed the room in golden light, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. Oliver, snug beneath his blankets, blinked sleepily at his grandmother, his excitement barely subdued by his growing drowsiness. Brenda took a slow sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest before beginning her next story. "Tonight," she murmured, placing her teacup on the bedside table, "I'll tell you about a man who found laughter even in his darkest days. A man who wore joy on his face but carried sorrow in his heart." Oliver's brows knitted together in curiosity. "A clown?" Brenda smiled. "Yes, a clown, but not just any clown. He was special. His name was Marco, and he wasn't always a performer. Before the circus, before the painted smiles, Marco had been something else entirely." Oliver tilted his head. "What was he before?" Brenda exhaled softly. "A man who had lost everything." Oliver's breath hitched slightly. "What happened to him?" Brenda folded her hands in her lap, her voice gentle but steady. "I met Marco on a summer evening. The train was making its way through rolling fields of sunflowers, their golden heads swaying in the wind. The cabin was lively, families traveling, children giggling, lovers whispering to one another. And then, there was him. A man dressed in bright, mismatched clothes, a red nose sitting atop his face, and a bag full of colorful props at his feet." Oliver's eyes widened. "A real clown on a train?" Brenda chuckled. "Yes, he wasn't performing, but he had the aura of someone who carried joy wherever he went. He sat with a group of children, making balloon animals with swift, practiced hands. Their laughter rang through the car, and for a while it was as if the entire world was a little lighter." Oliver smiled faintly. "That sounds nice." Brenda nodded. "It was, but as I watched him, I noticed something. When the children weren't looking, his smile faded just for a moment. His shoulders sagged slightly, and there was something in his eyes, something deep, hidden, almost like a shadow passing through the light." Oliver's expression grew solemn. "He was sad?" Brenda sighed. "Yes, and I didn't know why, not at first. When I finally sat beside him, I asked, 'You bring so much happiness to others, but what brings happiness to you?'" Oliver held his breath, waiting. Brenda's voice softened. "Marco looked at me then, really looked, as if deciding whether or not to let me see past the mask he wore. And then, very quietly, he said, 'I once had a family, a wife, a little girl. They were my whole world.'" Oliver swallowed hard. "What happened to them?" Brenda hesitated, the memory heavy in her chest. "He lost them. A car accident. One moment they were laughing together, and the next they were gone. Just like that, his entire world collapsed." Oliver's eyes filled with sadness. "That's awful." Brenda nodded. "It was. He told me he didn't know how to go on. He spent months locked in grief, unable to move, unable to find meaning in anything. And then one day, he walked past a small circus tent. He heard laughter inside, children giggling, people cheering, and something inside him stirred." She took another sip of tea, letting the quiet settle before continuing. "He walked into that tent and saw a clown performing tricks, making people laugh. And for the first time in months, he felt something shift inside him, a small flickering light in the darkness. He didn't know why, but he knew he had to be part of it. He joined the circus that very night." Oliver blinked. "Just like that?" Brenda smiled. "Just like that. He told me I couldn't change the past. I couldn't bring them back, but I could do something. I could make people laugh. I could bring them joy, even when I had none left for myself." Oliver sniffled slightly. "So he became a clown?" Brenda nodded. Not because he wanted to hide behind a mask, but because he wanted to give people something he had lost: happiness. Oliver was quiet for a long moment before whispering, "Did it help? Did he ever feel happy again?" Brenda brushed a hand through his hair. "I think he did in his own way. Laughter became his way of healing, his way of keeping his family's memory alive. Every time he made a child smile, it was like a small piece of his heart mended." Oliver curled deeper into his blankets. "I like Marco." Brenda's smile was soft. "I did too. He taught me something important, Oliver. He taught me that sometimes the people who bring the most joy are the ones who have known the most sorrow, and that even in sadness, we can still choose to bring light to others." Oliver yawned, his eyes growing heavy. "That was a good one, Grandma." Brenda leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Tomorrow, I'll tell you the last story, the final lesson I learned from all these journeys." Oliver's breathing slowed as sleep claimed him, his dreams filled with bright colors, laughter, and the sound of a train moving ever forward. Brenda sat back, gazing at the dim light of the lamp, her heart full with the weight of memories. Tomorrow, the journey would come to its final stop, but tonight the stories still lingered in the quiet of the night. The night air was still, carrying the faint scent of damp earth from the evening rain. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. Oliver lay beneath his blankets, his eyes heavy with sleep yet unwilling to close, knowing that tonight was different. Tonight was the last story. Brenda sat beside him, her teacup resting on the nightstand, her fingers idly tracing the rim as if she were touching the edges of a memory. She gazed at Oliver, her heart warm with the thought that through these stories she had given him pieces of her past, fragments of people who had shaped her, moments that had carved wisdom into her soul. "This is the last one, Grandma," Oliver murmured, his voice thick with drowsiness and longing. "The final lesson." Brenda smiled softly, brushing his hair from his forehead. "Yes, my love, and this story isn't about just one person, it's about all of them." Oliver's brows furrowed. "All the people you met?" Brenda nodded, leaning back in her chair. "Yes, each of them carried something, an experience, a struggle, a hope, a regret, and each of them left me with a lesson I've carried my whole life. Tonight, I want to share those lessons with you." Oliver shifted under his blankets, listening intently. She took a slow breath before speaking. "Lucas, the pianist, taught me that dreams are worth chasing, no matter what the world tells you. That passion isn't a choice, it's part of who we are. The silent soldier showed me that even in the deepest wounds, there is hope. That home isn't just a place, it's the people waiting for you." Oliver blinked up at her, hanging on to every word. "The runaway bride taught me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from what's expected of you and into the unknown. The orphan with the sketchbook reminded me that everyone has a story written in their eyes, and if we look closely enough, we might just see the truth." She glanced at the nightstand, where an old music sheet, a folded letter, and a faded sketch lay among her keepsakes. "The secret millionaire taught me that wealth is measured not in what we keep, but in what we give away. The lost scientist showed me that memories live in places we least expect, waiting for the right moment to return." Oliver's lips parted slightly, as though absorbing the weight of these stories in a way he hadn't before. "The mother searching for her son reminded me that love never fades, not even after years of distance. That hope is the strongest thread in the fabric of our lives. And Marco, the joyful clown, taught me that sometimes those who carry the heaviest sorrows are the ones who work hardest to make others smile." Brenda let out a soft sigh, her eyes glistening in the lamplight. "And do you know what I learned from them all?" Oliver shook his head, watching her with quiet reverence. She took his small hand in hers, squeezing gently. "That life is a journey, that no matter where we go, No matter how many tracks we travel, the most important thing is the kindness we leave behind. We cannot judge a person by their appearance, by their past, by the fleeting glimpses we see of them, because everyone carries a story. And if we take the time to listen, we might just learn something that changes us forever. A silence stretched between them, warm and full, as if the weight of every story Brenda had ever told now rested in Oliver's heart. He exhaled slowly, curling deeper into his pillow. "I love your stories, Grandma," he murmured. "I love all the people in them." Brenda smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Then I've done my job." Oliver's eyelids fluttered closed, his breathing steady and calm. Brenda sat for a long time, listening to the quiet, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. Then she reached for her tea, took one final sip, and gazed out the window at the silent railway tracks in the distance. The train of memories kept moving, rolling onward through time. But tonight, the journey had come to a peaceful stop. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Ticket to Yesterday. If you enjoyed the story, consider liking. If you feel the moments of Brenda, share with your loved ones if you feel worthy. If you're not already, subscribe for more peaceful and relaxing journeys. Your encouragement helps us come up with more stories. Good night. Sweet dreams from Story Planet.